Hi, welcome back to part two of my Fusion tutorials. If you haven't watched part one, please watch part one so that you can get to know your way around the basic user interface and navigation for Fusion 360. If you have tuned into part one, this is where it starts to get a little bit more exciting. We're going to begin to create some objects in Fusion 360. Fusion 360 works on a hierarchical system that is organized in the browser. And the system works with components. A component essentially is an object in Fusion 360, and it can be a collection of objects. You can think about a component maybe as a mechanical system, a simple way to think about it, like the pedals and gears of a bicycle might be a set of multiple components. The pedals themselves might be a component, the gears might be another component, right? And within each component there are multiple objects. Fusion 360 uses what's called a parametric editing algorithm, which means that you can continually go back in history and adjust and readjust your objects, which is really truly one of the great powers of Fusion 360. In order to harness this, you have to adhere strictly to the component organization system. So the first thing that you need to do when you open up Fusion 360 is create a new component. And I can't emphasize this enough. The first thing you need to do is create a new component. It's very, very important. So we're going to go to the Create menu up here, and we're going to choose, it's right at the top, of course, New Component. All right. And from here, you can just keep basically the standard options, except it's always a good idea to give your component a name. Now, we're not going to be making anything terribly interesting today. We're just going to be doing some basic extruding, so I'll just call this an extrude so that I can remember that that's what that is. Now, right now it has a parent, and in fact you can have components inside components. The actual file itself is the master component, or the sort of the top of the list here, and that is what our parent is. So it's actually a child of our master component, or our file, which it says unsaved at the moment, which we'll fix in a second. So I'm going to click OK. And now you can see in the browser here, extrude is a new component. Okay, and if we twirl down or click on the arrow next to it, you can see right now the only thing it has associated with it is an origin, or a place in space. So that's all it is. It's essentially just a point in space. It's a reference right now. Let's fix the fact that our document is unsaved. It's always a good idea to start by saving your document. And in fact, Fusion will autosave your document for you, but you need to save it first. We're going to go up to the File menu, this little turning page icon at the top, and we're just going to choose Save. And we'll call this our extrude, just to keep things consistent. And it actually has a location, and if you remember from the previous video, I created a project called C-Clamp, which is eventually what we'll be creating. But for this right now, we're doing a simple extrude, so that's going to be a file inside the C-Clamp project. All right, now you'll notice right here in our data panel that our extrude project, or our extrude file rather, has appeared inside of our project. Okay, so let's create an object in Fusion, in this extrude component inside Fusion 360. In order to do that, we're going to need to create a sketch. Fusion works mostly by creating two-dimensional sketches and then somehow turning those into rather complicated three-dimensional objects. Now, it is important to note that in general, Fusion is really good for creating geometric types of objects, and for the most part we're going to be creating geometric objects. There are options for creating more organic types of shapes, but in my opinion there are better programs that do that, and you could look into Blender, ZBrush, and other options to create organic types of models. So we're going to be working most with geometric shapes, so keep that in mind. Alright, so again, like I said, we're going to create from a sketch. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is create a sketch. So let's create a sketch. We're going to go back to that Create menu and choose Create Sketch. Now, right when we do that, all of a sudden Fusion wants us to select a plane for that sketch. Remember how I said there were three axes? There's a x-axis, there's a y-axis, and a z-axis. Well, they're the same with the planes, right? And we need to select an axis. Where's our sketch going to live? And of course, this is going to be dictated mostly by how you want it to appear. But for us right now, let's put it on what is our apparent floor, or the z-axis right here. And so immediately when you click on that axis, Fusion orients your view so that you're facing straight down and in a two-dimensional view, because we're going to be creating a two-dimensional sketch. We also get the sketch palette, which gives us a lot of options to work with our sketch. Okay? Fusion is very sophisticated in terms of being able to work with sketches, dimensions, and many things like that. You'll also notice that our menu options here at the very top have changed, as now we're working in the sketch mode. Now the Create menu has things like creating a line or a rectangle or a circle or a spline, a sort of freeform curve. It has things like mirroring the sketch, dimensioning the sketch, filleting the sketch, cutting it, right? All these different options. It also has the option at the very end here on the right to finish the sketch, which we'll do when we're finally done with the sketch. We can also do that from the sketch palette here. There's a Finish Sketch button. All right, so let's create a simple sketch. I'm going to create a simple rectangle at first. And I'm just going to click on the 2-point rectangle here, which allows me to create a rectangle with 2 points. And I'm just going to click in one point and drag out to another point. It's important to note that immediately when I start clicking and dragging, I'm faced with some dimensions here. And I could even put in the dimensions at this point. You can see they're selected. I could actually just input a 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch rectangle if I wanted. Now those dimensions aren't set in stone, so if you know your dimensions, you can put them in. You could also just click and drag, or you could put in a sort of a scrap dimension, something that you're just going to work with for a temporary time until you dimension it later. So let's start with 3.5 by 3.5. That sounds good. I'm going to hit Return on my keyboard, and that's going to give me my sketch. Okay, so now I've made a rectangle. And you can see by the indications in the sketch that it's 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. All right, I could change the dimensions anytime I want by double-clicking on them and changing them. Let's say I want this actually to be a 3.5 by 5 inch rectangle. Okay, now I've got a 3.5 by 5. Maybe I want it to be 4 by 5. Okay, so I can do that anytime interactively, right? Okay, there are lots of other sketch objects that we can create. We can create a line. We can create a circle, right? Lots of other things. Let's add a circle. I'm going to add my circle here. And notice that as I bring my cursor over on my object here, it's going to snap to various points, right? It's going to snap to the edges, okay? If I snap to this bottom edge and I move my cursor along the bottom edge, it's also going to show me the center point of that edge. Notice how right there it pops up with the little triangle. That means that's actually the center point of that edge, which is really useful in trying to coordinate where you're going to put things. A lot of times things go in the center. I can then mouse up and notice how it's actually creating a little sketch line for me, saying that I'm in the center, right? I'm staying in the center. And then it's even going to snap again to the center of the next edge. Look at that. It knows immediately where the center of the next edge is. And interestingly enough, that's where I want my circle. So I'm going to click here and drag out a 2.25 inch circle. Okay. All right. That's pretty good for, I think, for my first object. So I'm going to finish my sketch here. When I click Finish Sketch, you'll notice that I return to our familiar environment here in Fusion. And now, if you look underneath my extrude component here, not only does it have an origin, but it has a sketches folder that's been created. I can twirl down or click on the arrow next to the sketches, and I see my sketch. I could give my sketch a name if I want by double-clicking on it. First sketch isn't a particularly descriptive name, but you can rename all of your sketches if you'd like. I can toggle its visibility by clicking on the eye, which incidentally I can do for any of the elements in any of the browser categories here. I could even toggle the entire component's visibility. Okay. Most importantly about the sketch, though, is that I can right-click on it and choose Edit Sketch. And then I can go back and edit my sketch. Remember how I said that Fusion is very fluid and it uses parametric editing? in order to be able to go back in time? Well, I can adjust anything at any time in Fusion, and one of the great things to adjust is your sketch. Let's say I messed up my dimensions, and in fact it's not actually 5 inches here. I'm actually going to double click on it. It's actually 4.75 inches. Okay, and then I'm going to finish my sketch. All right, so editing your sketch, that's another great skill. So we've created a simple sketch here. We've edited our sketch. We've dimensioned our sketch. There's many other options with sketching, but we've done something very simple. Now let's actually make an object. The simplest way to make an object in Fusion is to extrude, okay? And that's to take our sketch and extrude it. In other words, use this profile to form a three-dimensional object. Now we actually have two sketch profiles. We have a rectangular profile and then we have a circular profile. Now when we extrude, we could actually use just one and have a hole in the center. We could actually just use the other and make a cylinder, right? Or we could take both and make a solid object. In order to extrude, okay, the easiest way is simply to push E on the keyboard, but there's also an extrude option right next to the sketch option at the top in the menu. You can click on extrude. And then it wants you to select the profile. So you can see here, the different profiles are going to light right up for you. Fusion's pretty smart and it's selecting. So let's say I want to extrude the whole thing. So I'm going to click on the first profile. And then you'll notice, well, I've got that part, but I want to make sure that the inside isn't hollow. So I'm going to hold Shift and I'm going to select the inner piece. And then again, I can either use the arrow here to interactively decide how big I want it, or I can input my precise dimension. So let's say, for example, I want it to be 6 inches tall. Push Enter, and it is now 6 inches tall. I've extruded that whole object. All right. Let's look now in our browser and notice that in our extrude component we have not only sketches but also bodies. Okay? When I extrude a sketch, it becomes a body, and you can see that if I twirl down on the bodies folder, there's the body right there. Again, I can toggle the visibility of the body on and off, and it shows me my object or not. Another useful organizational tool, especially when you get a lot of objects. Okay. Now, sketches and extrusions can be used not only to create objects, but to subtract from objects. Okay? So if I look here in my extrude component, you'll notice that after I make the object, the sketch, which is actually on the bottom here, is now transparent because it's been turned off by default. So if I turn it back on, you can see there's my sketch sitting there on my object. Let's say I wanted to actually cut that hole out of the center. I could use the extrude for the same thing. When I click on extrude now, I'm going to click on the object that I want to extrude, and Fusion is so smart that it knows that if I just click and drag up through, notice how that extrusion is red now, it's actually going to cut that through that object, right? And I can actually control that here in the extrude panel. You'll notice in the bottom the operation is set to now cut. Now let's say I didn't like Fusion's default idea of what I wanted to do. Let's say I actually wanted to add that object. I could make it join, which would make it the same object. Okay. I could make it intersect, which is actually only going to keep the overlapping portion. Or I could make it a new body, make it its own new body that I could then move around later. Or a new component, which would be its own new component. I actually want it to cut, so I'm going to keep cut, but it's important to know that you can control those features. I'm just going to push return on my keyboard, and now I've actually created a simple hole through my little extrusion here. Okay? Believe it or not, you can create a lot of objects just using sketches and extrusions. And you may think, oh, wow, this is pretty boring, right? Well, think about it. We could actually add some more sketches to this object to make it a little bit more interesting. Let's say we wanted to inset some of these faces. In other words, create an indentation, almost like a frame that exists on some of these faces. How would we do something like that? Well, what's great about sketches is that sketches can exist not only on the different axes, the X, Y, and Z axis, but also on the faces of the object. So let's take a look at that to create some inset faces. I'm going to create a sketch here, and then instead of choosing one of the default planes, you'll notice that as I mouse over my object, the actual faces of the object show up. I'm going to click this face here. And now you'll see in orthographic view, or a flat two-dimensional view, I now have my object right here. And I want to inset this face. In other words, I want to create a frame that is exactly the same width all the way around and punch in a little bit into my object to create a little detail. How am I going to do that? Well, I could use the rectangle tool and recreate the rectangle. That would be pretty easy. This is a pretty simple object, but let's say I had a more complicated object. One of the wonderful things that you can do in the sketch palette is project sketches and object profiles from objects onto your current sketch. That's a really wonderful thing to be able to do. Let me show you how to do that. I'm going to go to the Create menu here, okay, and I'm going to choose Project Include and then Project. You'll notice I can also use P on the keyboard to accomplish this. Once I do that, it's going to ask me for the geometry. I'm going to project this profile, click on it here, onto our sketch, and then click OK. Then you'll notice that there's actually a projection, a purple line, different than our blue sketch line here, of this object here, which is really great because now I can use this in order to create that inset. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm actually going to use another commonly used kind of sketch trick called the offset. And the offset allows us to take an existing sketch profile, even if it is projected, and bring it in or out by a certain dimension. The offset function's here at the top. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to click on the profile that I want to offset. And then I can input, again, a precise number, both here and in the offset window. Or I could just do it visually here, click and drag. And you can see I'm getting exactly what I want, that inset face that's evenly spaced from all sides. Let's say I actually want a precise dimension. I want it to be minus 0.1, just one, sorry, not 0.1, minus 1 inch in, so that we've got a nice big thick frame. All right, I'm going to push return. And you'll notice that now I've got that wonderful inset rectangle. I've also got an indication that this is offset by 1 inch, which I could easily go back, double click, and say, oh no, I really wanted minus 0.5. I was just kidding. All right, so now I'm going to finish my sketch. And then again, I'm going to use that extrude, click on that face, to create an inset face. Maybe it's only going to go in minus 0.125 inches, just enough. And now I've created that nice little inset face, right? And we just were working with simple rectangles, but we could work with much more complicated curves, and we will as we get more used to the Fusion environment. You can see again that that sketch got turned off when I created the extrusion. That's just so that you can see your object a little bit better. Okay, so that is how to create very simple but also possibly complicated objects from extrusions and sketches. I encourage you to experiment creating your own sketches, creating some simple extrusions, and also to tune in for the next video that is going to be a little bit more advanced topics on creating objects, creating more advanced curves, and other options we have for creating objects besides using extrusions in Fusion 360. So hopefully you'll tune in for that.